Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, COVID-19 and Trends in Payments. Thank you for joining us today. Hi, I'm Judy Howard with ARC's Customer Experience and Operations team, and I'm excited to introduce my colleagues, Jennifer Watkins, Director of Payments, and Kevin Haag, Manager, Payment Processing and Acceptance, who are part of ARC's Airline Retailing and Settlement team. Jennifer and Kevin have put together this informative session to review and discuss key insights and takeaways from our annual ARC's payment forum that took place virtually this past June. Jennifer and Kevin are focused on aligning payment, acceptance, and processing travel agency distribution channel with payment industry best practices. That's what they do here at ARC for us, while reducing fraud and loss, ensuring a cost-effective payment focused on customer experience and innovation. And they bring years of experience in this field with them. I'd like to say collectively, like maybe over 50 years. So they bring with them a lot of knowledge that they'll be able to share with you today. But however, before we get started and I turn this presentation over to Jennifer, we will be muted. Everyone will be muted through the call today. However, if you want to ask questions, please go to the control panel and type in your questions. And Kevin and Jennifer will be interactive throughout the session today and get to as many questions as possible. Just to answer a global question, this session will be recorded today and will be posted on our website, and we'll send it out in the thank you follow-up email as well. So without further ado, Jennifer, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Judy. Welcome, everyone. We're happy to have you here to talk about payments and COVID. It's been a challenging year so far, to say the least. But we're going to talk a little bit about what the impact is on payments and specifically probably chargebacks, which is kind of top of mind for everyone. So here's our agenda, and Judy just covered the housekeeping. We're going to also talk about the ARC Payments Forum. So Judy talked a little bit about it. This is the third or fourth year I've done a session for agents following our annual ARC Payments Forum. And that's kind of the catalyst for this. But we also know that chargebacks and COVID-19 disputes are top of mind. So there's sort of a focus on that. We're going to talk about trends in payments. Kevin's going to talk about credit card acceptance and 3D Secure. We'll talk about chargebacks and then share some key insights from the payments forum, some takeaways, and then we'll do a wrap up. Like Judy said, we will take questions throughout. So type in your questions, and Kevin and I will sort of pause between various sections and I'll try to answer those questions. So the ARC Payments Forum, the goal of it, the ARC Payments Forum, and let me just, a little bit of background, is it includes agents, airlines, the GDSs, the card brands, IATA attends, ASTA attends, and the goal was to bring all of the participants in the transaction flow together to ensure that we are supporting payments processing in a way that provides the best customer experience, improves risk management, and therefore prevents loss, and ensures the lowest cost processing of payments. And so we started about 6 years ago putting this together because we were having some challenges around getting transactions settled successfully, where the airlines were getting paid, the customers were being billed, and it was tied to some changes that the card brands had made that the industry just wasn't aware of. So we wanted to bring the industry and the card brands closer together to manage through changes over time. And every year there are new changes. So that's the goal of the payments forum. We'll go to the next slide. So let me just I'll do a really high level payments update, and then Kevin will get into a little bit more detail. So the landscape, we have 235 airlines. This is as of the end of 2019. And up and down, and it actually goes up and down always. Right now, with COVID, surprisingly, we've been pretty flat. You know, we've lost a couple of airlines, but generally we're pretty flat over the last several months. We have about 11,000, close to 12,000 agency locations. In 2019, ARC settled $97.4 billion in transactions. We had a record-breaking number of agency transactions last year, which is huge. But we did see the first decline in cash sales since 2012. and Kevin has some stats he'll show on that. We process about 10% cash and 90% credit, and that has remained pretty consistent, up or down, sort of a point or a point and a half, but it's been pretty consistent since, oh gosh, I would say the mid-90s. Next slide. So this shows the total transactions over time, and it's a long period of time. You can see that we saw a dip, and that's September 11, 2001. We were hitting right back up there in 2017, 2018, 2019. I think we're going to see probably, well, we know we're going to see another dip this year, but things have been progressing and growing over time for sure, just from a transaction processing perspective. This slide shows agency locations. You can see that the number of locations peaked in the mid to late 90s. This was back, if people have been in the industry for a while, you remember satellite ticket printer locations. That was a location where there's basically a printer within someone's office or within offices, several offices within being managed by a home agency. And that with the e-tickets and the consolidation of agents over the years, we've seen the number of agencies decreasing. Next is Kevin. So I'll hand it over to Kevin to get into a little bit more detail.
Thank you, Jennifer. Appreciate it. And welcome, everybody. Thank you for taking the time to join the webinar today. So I'm going to touch on a little bit of payment history, and then we're going to dig into 2020 a little deeper. So looking back from 2017 through 2019, the graph here shows total sales processed. As Jennifer mentioned, about $97 billion processed in total. And if you look at the bottom line, you can see the little dip in cash in 2019 from 2017 and 2018 growth. So we're still processing a little over $10 billion in cash, which just is tremendous. It really is interesting for me to see that amount being put through this environment in cash. So looking at cash and credit, as Jennifer alluded to, we've been pretty constant around the 10%, 80, 90% mark. And we peaked at 11.13% in 2017, and been keeping around the 10% mark as a cash to credit ratio in transaction volume. As we dig a little deeper, now we break it down by card brand, and one of the items I'll call your attention is you can see that Amex and MasterCard, MasterCard is starting to slowly gain on Amex a little bit in dollars, and Amex is starting to lose a little volume. So that's a trend that we've been watching probably prior to 2015, and starting to see that conversion slowly. And if you look at it by transaction count, that trend that really stands out. By the end of 2019, MasterCard is almost dead even with American Express on transaction volume. So when we take a look at average ticket, of course, UATP and Amex, even more in the corporate market, they're showing a little higher average ticket, as one would expect. So now we're going to jump into 2020. I'm going to start with sales. And you can see in this slide, the year starts out pretty normal. Then late January, we start to get a little bit of COVID news. And then you can definitely see what happens in early March, mid-March, when airlines stop flying, borders start closing, and the pandemic picks up. And then we also start to see a little uptick as we come out the end of April, early May. Businesses and borders are starting to open up, and volume is picking up, but still quite below where we were in the past. So take a look at transaction volumes. Again, as there'd be no surprise, a similar trend. And again, you see as we start to come out of late April, early May, volumes picking up. And then again here in early July, when a couple of states have seen an increase in COVID, we start to see the volume drop off a little bit. When we look at refund dollars, refunds peaked in mid-March in dollars or in credit and cash. And when we look at refunds, we see a similar trend that the volume has peaked in early March, and we start to slow down a little bit. This next slide we thought would be kind of interesting. At the early part of the year, you can see where a normal refund and exchange distribution would be for transactions. You see around 6% exchange and 2 to 4% refunds, and that's where we've been historically in the past. But then as COVID hits, and you can see in March, transaction volume drops, and you start to see refunds and exchanges. You guys have been living this, so this probably is really no surprise. And we end up seeing that peak around 60% in early April, and then it drops as transaction volume starts to pick up a little bit, and then we get another little peak in early July, again, as some of the states start to close again because of an increase in COVID. If we jump down to a brand level again, here you can see for the early part of 2020, very similar trend on the sales side with the brands as one would expect. So one of the key points here is just if you look around March 8th, you can see where MasterCard finally overtakes Amex as far as total dollar volume that is being put through ARC. And then when you again look at the transaction volume, similar flow and similar view, but as you notice right away, mid-January, MasterCard has already overtaken Amex as far as the number of transactions processed. Now when we jump into refunds, from a refund perspective at the card brand level, you can see here one of the interesting items is Amex. Their volume peaked in early March from a dollar refund perspective, and MasterCard and Visa, they peaked around mid-March. And oddly enough, UATP was the last to peak, so they were able to hold on to funds for their airlines longer than the other brands. When we look at refund transactions, again, no surprise, following right along with refund sales. Amex went ahead and peaked in mid-March, and MasterCard and Visa ended up peaking in mid-March to late April or late March, and early April you see UATP peaking at that point. Any questions before I go on to card acceptance?
Got some feedback that were hard to hear, so maybe we just need to enunciate.
Okay. Yep.
I don't know what else to do.
Yep. Hopefully I'll try to enunciate better, and we'll go from there. So good. Well, with that, we'll move on to our discussion on card acceptance, and we're going to talk about authorizations. Let me do a little level setting with this particular topic. We all know authorizations have been around a long time, and the reasons we're bringing this up is back in the fourth quarter of 2019, the brands alerted ARC that they're going to start to focus a little bit more on authorization requirements and authorization data. And so what that noted to us is that we then went out to the agencies with some TAC messages. And the first TAC message went out in April just as a reminder on best practices around authorizations, and we sent out another message in April as well as a reminder. So what was really driving this, from an Amex perspective particularly, Amex noted and came out in one of their newsletters to us and some information about going with some authorizations and rejecting at settlement. And so this was new to us and really something that made us go out with those announcements, because rejecting transactions at settlements for invalid auths wasn't something that has taken place before in the industry. So we really wanted to make sure that we alerted the agencies to this requirement. As well as Visa said that they are going to do some additional work on their side for authorizations and how they monitor that. So Amex went ahead and put in some changes early March about requirements around authorizations, and it wasn't very long after that implementation date of, I believe, around March 10th, that ARC received its first notice on an agency that was putting through invalid authorizations. So we reached out to that agency, alerted them to the fact that the authorizations were invalid, and Amex brought it to our attention, and there was the risk that those transactions would be rejected at settlement. The airline would get paid, and as a result, there might be a potential debit memo out to the agency. Visa had a similar issue, and they reached out to one of the key airlines here in the U.S. That airline reached out to us and notified us that Visa had mentioned they are seeing some invalid auth. And so again, we had looked through the transactions, we identified the agency and reached out to them. So from that perspective, the agencies are out there. There's some of them that are doing some invalid authorization work. So we want to make sure that as we're notified that we're reaching out with those agencies and working with them. So part of the requirement of our industry is to obtain an authorization. So, and the reason for authorizations, number one, we want to make sure that we have a valid active account. So authorizations give us that. We want to make sure that we have a open to buy available for that transaction to take place. So from that perspective, making sure that we're getting those authorizations, we're mitigating risk of potential chargebacks for invalid authorizations and no authorizations, and managing that risk process with authorizations up front. So when we jump to the valid authorization section, I think the key here is valid. We really want to make sure that we're going through the GDSs and obtaining a valid authorization systematically through the GDS at the time of ticketing. So that's key. The GDSs then do some work and pass information on to us, but it's important to follow that process, and one of the best practices outlined in Section 6 of the handbook about how you go ahead and process authorizations and the timing of those. And we've seen some examples in the past, and we continue to monitor. An agency, for some reason or another, may put in a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Whether they think that the cardholder, they've long-term, they've done plenty of bookings with this particular customer, and so they know the card's good, and they put in a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or even put in the date. And then those will end up getting identified now at the back end, and authorizations may fail, and then you end up with the potential for a debit memo if there's a chargeback based on an invalid authorization. So, and finally, we come to non-compliance, and really non-compliance impacts, from a merchant perspective, some additional fees. So as we talked about from an authorization perspective, if you're out there with an invalid authorization, there might be some misuse fees that occur. From an airline perspective, they get a fee from the brands, and they pass those fees along. And so on the settlement side, for instance, if you assume that an authorization or transaction does settle, but the authorization is invalid, as potentially the case of with a Visa transaction, there is that risk of additional non-compliance fees taking place and a debit memo coming to the agency. So I will go on to the next. So let's talk a little bit about 3D Secure and what's ARC been doing to support the industry. So from a 3D Secure perspective, what is 3D Secure? At a very high level, 3D Secure is a service providing additional levels of security for transactions taking place online with a debit or credit card payment. So it's another tool for agencies to use out there to help reduce fraud and chargebacks. So for those who have been around for a while, there's a number of programs out that the cards have. American Express's program is SafeKey. Discover is a Protect By. MasterCard is Identity Check, or in the past it was Secure Code. Visa's is Visa Secure, or it was before that Verified by Visa. So if you're out there on websites shopping and you might see some of these terminologies, you'll know that those are 3D secured transactions. So to give you a little history, ARC started this effort back in probably late 2015. We ended up working with the brands, identifying the various partners, working with what we could do to bring 3D Secure to the industry. And from that perspective, there was a lot of work to do. As you guys well know, the airline industry is a little different from a traditional retail. There's a lot of partners, a lot of players in the payment system. And so to make sure that the 3D Secure would work, we had to work with the brands and the various partners to understand how that process would work and what type of requirements would be needed to make that process work in the agency channel. So working with the brands, with the GDSs, with third-party providers, we identified those requirements. We updated our spec that we share with the system providers or the GDSs on how they share data with ARC. And then we published those specs, and we went out and ARC implemented those changes on our system back in July of 2017. And then we shared that information with the GDSs, and of course, they needed to get those changes on their roadmap in order to support the changes. So with the background there, that brings us into what's the current status of 3D Secure for the US market. So right now, the GDSs and airlines and the EU agencies with international operations are really focused in on Europe. From Europe's perspective, they have an initiative out there that's government mandated. It's Payments Service Directive 2, and it's really European Data Security and Privacy Initiative. That deadline to support that initiative is January of 2021. So really, the GDSs and airlines are focusing on meeting that deadline so they can support that initiative over in Europe. Also, we ended up doing a small controlled test back in December. Sabre reached out to us, and they had an inquiry from an OTA that was interested in doing some work with 3DS. So at that time, we coordinated with Sabre and the brands and the acquirers and really all the payment partners in the chain of the payment processing to do a small test. We ran about 4 to 5 MasterCard transactions through and about 4 to 5 Visa transactions through in a live environment. And really what the goal was to make sure that the liability shift took place for these transactions. So the transactions came through, we monitored them all the way through, we handed them off to Visa and MasterCard, and they came back and mentioned that the transactions that we provided were eligible for the liability shift. So we had successful 3DS transactions confirmed back in January. So technically, the industry is set up for it. We are still working with a couple of the other GDSs, Sabre, Travelport, Fairlogic, and Amadeus on getting tests set up with them. But we are in a position now to support 3DS in the travel agency channel. So if you're interested in what 3DS potentially could do for you, I would say start the conversation with your GDS. And then if you still need some additional information, you can reach out to ARC here and we can help with that process. So what are next steps for 3DS in the travel agency channel? Well, right now we're moving towards EMV 3DS or 2.0. And if I just take a little step back, a lot of the conversation I had earlier in the test that we did was done with 1.0. And really 1.0 is probably 10 to 12 years old, and it was really based around a desktop solution. But 2.0 is moving more towards the support of mobile e-commerce, mobile phones, tablets. And so we are looking at updating our spec in order to go ahead and support the necessary requirements for 2.0, and again, sharing that information with the GDSs and other interested parties, so we're all set to go when we start to move to 2.0. So from that perspective, we're ready to move forward when the agencies are under the current environment. You know, there's other things that I think we're all working with and dealing with, so hopefully as things start to progress back to normal, we will go ahead and be in a position to help support and start moving forward with 3DS. So with that, I will stop. I see that Jennifer's been busy answering any questions.
Yes, we do not have any questions. If you have questions about 3D Secure or the authorization requirements, which is kind of important right now, just because we're seeing travel agency transactions rejecting, which leads to debit memos, which we are always doing our best to avoid. Let us know if you have any questions.
Great.
Don't see any right now, but sometimes it takes a minute to catch up.
Good.
So we can go on
well, with
to
that,
the
Jennifer,
next.
I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Chargebacks and disputes, everyone's favorite subject. And so this is showing sort of what the trend was at the end of 2019 and through time. And it's fantastic that at the end of 2019, we were down to just over 4 basis points in chargebacks. These are chargebacks that are entered into Memo Manager. So when you tie that out to the credit card transactions ARC process, we are at 4 basis points, which is amazing. And we constantly hear from the card brands, and we actually heard this at the payments forum this year, that chargebacks for agency channel are for airline ticket sales is less than airline direct sales. Which I think says a lot about sort of the agency relationship with their customer and for the large OTAs, the work that they do to try to prevent fraud. So that's been great. Now, 2019, this is showing by week. And so I've got dates for each sort of weekend here. You can see the orange line is 2019. The blue-green line is 2020, and so we see pretty significant increase in 2020. And these spikes are typically when one of the larger airlines enters their chargeback debit memos. So I wish I could say that it's trending down. I don't think that we can say that yet, but we're hopeful. And so this is by amount. When we look at it by count, which is the next slide, it's about the same. It shows spikes where we know there's one large airline that's putting in their debit memos. It looks like probably on a monthly basis, and that's where those spikes come in. Next, so let me just kind of cover what's unique about chargebacks during COVID-19. And because they are unique from what we would typically talk about related to chargebacks. One of the things that happened was that airlines and agencies were unable to manage the customer service calls, which meant that it was easier for cardholders or customers to go to their card issuing bank and dispute the transaction as opposed to wait on hold for hours or in some cases wait for weeks and weeks to get their refunds. And so it was just the sheer volume of refund requests and canceled flights that occurred in the March-April timeframe and actually continues that has driven the number of disputes because agencies and airlines just have not been able to manage the volume. Customers don't know where their refund is. They don't know what the expectations were when they reached out to the airline. Are they getting a refund? Are they getting a voucher? And so the easiest thing for them to do is to go to their card issuer and initiate a dispute, and that's what's happened. The other thing that we saw early on in COVID-19 is that refund and exchange policies were changing on a pretty regular basis. I think there was at least one airline that changed their policy 2 or 3 times in a week. And so that causes confusion. And again, then it just becomes easier for the cardholder to go to their card issuing bank and initiate a dispute. The third challenge over airline procedures for handling credit for future travel. Typically, each airline has a different way of doing it. And so and in this case, as airlines were desperately trying to hold on to funds, it was even more confusing for agents to figure out how the voucher should be handled. Is it the old ticket? Is there a new ticket that's issued an exchange that can then be used for future travel, an MCO. And so one of the things ARC has is we have a chargeback subgroup and we have a debit memo working group. The chargeback subgroup, starting in early April, was meeting weekly to talk about chargebacks. And that group is made up of agents and airlines, representatives from ARC, just talking through sort of what we were experiencing around chargebacks and trying to define best practices, which I'll get into in a little bit. But one of the things that was highlighted out of that is confusion for agents around how airlines are handling that. And so ARC has published some guidance on our website around procedures for handling credit for future travel, vouchers, things like that. We saw a shift from fraud disputes to service or terms and conditions related disputes. So for me, disputes fall into two categories in the airline industry. You have fraud chargebacks, and then you have service-related chargebacks. And typically, the fraud-related chargebacks are much more prevalent than the terms and conditions-related chargebacks. This flip-flopped that, where even the fraudsters weren't traveling during COVID, so we saw fraud go down, and all of the disputes are really around where's my refund, the flight was canceled, things that are terms and conditions or refund related. Next is just, again, the volume. And so airlines and agents, when an airline was getting a dispute, what they should be doing is reaching out to the agency and saying, hey, I received a dispute. Can you provide me with some support back that will help me defend this chargeback or dispute? And because of the sheer volume, that wasn't happening. And sort of on top of that, the airlines weren't responding either. Airline and agency concerns were prevalent over cardholders receiving a credit and a refund. And a chargeback. So the airline is in the process of initiating the refund to the cardholder. And in the meantime, the cardholder is initiating a chargeback. And so they sort of, like say, cross in the night, where now the cardholder has initiated the chargeback and received a refund. Ideally, what needs to happen in that case is that the airline should be responding back, or the agency should be responding back to the airline saying, hey, that is a refund. That's been refunded already. Provide that as support for the dispute, and it gets resolved. But because of the volume, there was concern over that happening, and I know that it has happened. It's particularly frustrating because the cardholders received the money twice. But I don't by any means think it's prevalent or that it happens frequently, but it does happen. And then, of course, agencies' concern over chargebacks that might be coming, debit memos that might be coming for transactions that they didn't have any control over. So we talked quite a bit about that, and I'll talk a little bit about ARC and ARC's position related to those agency concerns. Card brand suspend, and this is more for people who have your own merchant accounts, you are involved with card brands. One of the themes was that they all suspended their chargeback monitoring programs. So any merchant that has a high volume of chargebacks could be put into a chargeback monitoring program, and the card brands all suspended those programs for a period of time. It is ending, in one case ended at the end of July, or now I think it's MasterCard has pushed it to September 1. And I mentioned that we have a chargeback subgroup of agents and airlines. There's been an excellent collaboration between the two to try to work through this particularly difficult situation. I guess we can move on to the next slide unless we have some questions. Okay, we will move on. So this is what we sort of developed out of the chargeback subgroup as far as best practices for handling a dispute in COVID-19 situation. And it's generally applicable to probably all disputes, but one of the challenges, like I said, was managing the volume. And so this we felt like would help manage the volume as well. And the back and forth that could happen between agents and airlines if it's not handled appropriately. So this airline receives the dispute as the first step. Was it refunded to the original form of payment? If it was, then you respond to the refund saying it was refunded. And so this is for the airline, when they get that, just to respond back saying that was already refunded. There's no need for them to reach out to the agency for additional support or anything. Next, was the flight canceled? If the flight was canceled, then the guidance for the airline is accept the dispute, update the ticket status saying that it's been credited back, that it's closed, whatever an airline would do to update the status so that ticket can't be used again. And again, don't contact the agency. It's silly for an airline to reach out to an agency every time they receive a dispute when they canceled the flight. The guidance in the US has been pretty clear. If the airline canceled the flight, the customer is due a credit. Next, is the ticket refundable? If the ticket is refundable, again, accept the dispute and move on. Do not contact the agency, accept the dispute. Next, did the passenger cancel or no-show? This is a little bit different. The guidance from the card brands has been if the customer cancels, then they're not due a refund. Even if, or they may not be, I shouldn't say that, they may not be due a refund. If the ticket's refundable, that's different. Even if the airline subsequently cancels the flight. So in that case, the the airline would reach out to the agency and request documentation from them to support that dispute. Next is refunded, meaning the credit was provided via another means. Maybe it was a voucher, or it's the ticket that can be exchanged for future travel, something like that. Again, contact the agency, allow them to manage the customer and respond to the dispute. Next, flown. And so this is more getting into a fraud dispute. So if the ticket was flown, then, and this is typically what would happen, is the airline has information about whether or not that was flown. They can provide a flight manifest back, and if the customer is disputing that charge and the cardholder name matches the name on the flight manifest, that should reverse the dispute. And then finally, is the travel for future date? So the card brands have been pretty clear that a customer doesn't have a right to dispute a transaction when the flight hasn't occurred yet or services not rendered. So a customer can't call and say, I didn't get the services I purchased when the flight's in the future and it hasn't been canceled yet. If the customer wants to cancel the flight, if they decide they don't want to go and the flight is still going, then they don't have a chargeback right. They have to work with the airline to determine how to manage that transaction. I went through that pretty quickly. Do we have any questions?
Yes, Jennifer, there's a couple of questions. One is it true that merchant credit card charges cannot be refunded through IAR after 13 months? Looks like it's a generic one.
Merchant, let me make sure I understand. Merchant credit card chargebacks cannot be, are we talking about refunds?
Yes, it says merchant credit card charges cannot be refunded through IAR after 13 months.
So ARC actually does allow for refunds to be processed after 13 months, but it's up to the airline to decide if they want to open it up beyond 13 months.
So, and we have another one about, what about non-refundable tickets and the flights were canceled?
If the flight was canceled, the customers do a refund. And even if the ticket's non-refundable, I mean, the DOT provided guidance for airlines around when they cancel the flight, they should be issuing refunds to the customer. The card brands have also held that same position. So anytime we as cardholders purchase something and we don't get the services that we purchased, we're due a refund. And so the card brands have been pretty clear. Airline, if you cancel a flight, regardless of whether or not that's a refundable ticket or not, you should be issuing a credit to the customer.
Another question, what about international airlines that cancel routes and flights completely and then refuse to refund?
Well, that would be,
yeah, and airlines refuse to refund. So,
if the airline's refusing to refund a flight that's canceled, if I'm a cardholder, I'm just going to tell you, I'm going to dispute that charge and I'll get my money back. The challenge I think that we could see, and part of the frustration around this, is that that airline may then issue a debit memo to the agency saying, I want you to pay me for this. This was a non-refundable ticket, even if I canceled the flight. And ARC will not be standing behind those transactions. I hope that answers the question there. I cannot see the questions anymore. For some reason, I may have done something.
Slides by mail. So let me go through a couple of slides by mail. Dispute for future travel dates. If an airline is in voluntary administration, hasn't canceled flights, may or may not come out of voluntary administration, and then subsequently operates the flight, can the client dispute?
So I'm not sure what they, so I think what they're saying is that the airline's not flying right now. I guess
like it's future dated travel. And it looks like, I guess, voluntary administration and some type of bankruptcy. And the flight hasn't been canceled. Yep.
So maybe it's, whether it's bankruptcy or they've ceased flying for the moment. If that flight goes, then that cardholder, I expect, does not have a dispute right. If the flight takes off, then I would say that cardholder probably doesn't have a dispute right.
Okay. What if the airline refunds the refuses, I think, I'm sorry. What if the airline refuses to refund the ticket operating in the U.S.? I think you touched on that, but.
Yeah, I mean, if the flight's canceled and the airline refuses to refund it, then the cardholder has a dispute right. And meaning they call their card issuer and they can say, I didn't get the services I purchased, and they will win those disputes. I can see the questions again now. Sorry about that.
Nope.
Yeah, I mean, I see clearly there's sort of a theme around the European airlines potentially where you're still seeing chargebacks for potentially flights that were canceled. I see one question here about Air Canada. Air Canada has definitely taken a different position than the U.S. airlines, and I think they've taken the position that they're not subject to US DOT guidance. So that makes those particularly challenging. I would say if a customer disputes that transaction, though, the card brands are going to side with the cardholder. If the passenger doesn't want to travel, should not raise a debit memo on the passenger. So I can move on to, let me just move on to sort of ARC's position. Yeah, if you want to go to the next slide. So in April, ARC published this position, which is basically saying that ARC is not going to take action on debit memos that involved a flight canceled by an airline or government entity as a result of COVID-19, or are related to a passenger compensation dispute resulting from COVID-19. So what this means is that ARC will not be pursuing agents or threatening termination to enforce COVID-19 related chargeback debit memos. That doesn't mean that the airline couldn't still pursue the agency directly, but ARC will not pursue the agents and will not affect their accreditation status over chargebacks related to COVID-19. So hopefully that gives agents some peace of mind that ARC is not going to be pursuing you on these. Again, that doesn't mean that airlines, you know, we're talking about the European airlines, won't issue debit memos to you, but then it's going to be up to you to decide how you want to handle those. ARC is not going to get involved. I see one in here about, what about a flight operating to a destination on quarantine? So practically speaking, travelers could not travel without a 14-day quarantine to that destination. The card brands have said that that would not be a valid dispute. So because there's a quarantine requirement, and if the airline operated, the cardholder is responsible. And we can move on to the next slide, Kevin, which shows sort of some resources that are available. So this shows on the ARC website, there are resources for agents and airlines. And the next slide, Kevin, highlights on that page where we have FAQs, and we've got guidance from the card brands that are published out there. So there's links that will help you know, for example, how to handle, or what guidance they're providing to merchants around quarantine rules, or, you know, if a government completely shuts down the country and the airline can't fly there, you know, how should those be handled? Those types of things are all sort of covered under those guidelines, but we can talk about them here as well. So someone saying they put a complaint with the DOT about being held responsible for debit memos. Who helps and supports us, the travel agents? Like I said, ARC will not be pursuing agents related to debit memos, so that are tied to COVID-19. So, you know, we are here to support the agency community. Again, if an airline feels like they have a valid case, and they could pursue you, but ARC will not be pursuing you on behalf of the airlines. So here I've got a question. Is the authorization form from an agency as a credit on file, is it enough for an agency? The answer to that question is, it can be. So we haven't talked about compelling evidence, or we haven't talked about how to fight a dispute. We could do a whole nother webinar about that. Typically, a credit on file is something you can present back saying, this is a customer I've been doing business with for a period of time, demonstrate that you've been doing business with them for a period of time, they're a known customer, and you could win that dispute potentially, but it's not a guarantee. So in a card not present environment, which is almost all the transactions that are processed through travel agents today, there isn't a whole lot that will shift liability, like Kevin was talking about, related to 3D Secure, from the merchant to the cardholder beyond 3D Secure. So we, like I said, we could do a whole webinar on that. What do we do if we get a debit memo for chargeback on this one? on tickets. I mean, I think as a credit that were credited, if you get a chargeback from an airline, I would suggest responding to them as quickly as you can to defend the dispute. If it was refunded, tell them it was refunded and when it was refunded. If you get disputes for flights that are canceled, I'd respond back to the airline saying, this flight was canceled. This customer has a valid dispute. Do you see any other questions out there that are sort of key for us to respond to? Kevin, there's lots of questions.
Yeah, there are lots of them. I'm just trying to scan through.
See what the themes are here.
Yeah.
It's around, government restrictions. If there's a government restriction, if we can provide to the credit card company documentation saying that there was a travel restriction on that at that time, the dispute should stay with the cardholder. It's interesting. I think about chargebacks sometimes as the cardholder. How would I feel if I couldn't fly somewhere because of a government restriction? And what the card brands have said is, in those cases, you can offer the customer, as the merchant, as the airline, you can offer them a voucher for future travel, and they can use that. But yeah, it's a tough thing. I think most airlines, or at least the U.S. airlines, are issuing refunds to customers. We also, I didn't include, there's a question around here about TRS fees. ARC moved the TRS fees as well. So if you go to the ARC website, if you could go up to slide 33, Kevin.
Okay.
Just go up to, sorry. In this announcement that ARC made, there's lots of other information that's relevant for ARC Pay transactions, for example. There's also information on here about TRS and ARC extending the timeframes for fees related to TRS, just to give agents and airlines a better opportunity to manage the disputes. More time, because of the volume, everyone just needed more time to manage the disputes. And we actually were successful at getting American Express, for example, to extend the timeframes, which were really helpful. I see a question here about e-signatures. I mean, again, that's a whole nother webinar about chargebacks probably. An e-signature does not meet the burden of proof for the card brands. Card brands would not accept an e-signature as proof that the cardholder is who they say they are. Are we hearing of airlines not refunding quickly? Absolutely. I mean, we know the airlines have big queues of refunds that they've been managing. I think they've hopefully got it down to where it's manageable now, but it has been a big challenge for airlines and for agents to manage the volume of refunds that they are trying to manage. So let's go on to the next slide, just sort of some key insights from the 2020 Payments Forum real quickly. So what were the key themes? So the Payments Forum took place the week of June 16th, and we had each of the card brands come in Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday to talk about what's going on in their world and tied to COVID. So Visa was Monday, for example. We had American Express, MasterCard, Discover, and then ARC we did a summary on Friday. And so the themes out of each of those sessions was that COVID-19 is causing enormous disruption, particularly in travel, particularly with disputes. Another theme we heard about a lot is PSD2 and S strong cardholder authentication requirements in Europe. So PSD2 is a European regulation that requires strong cardholder authentication, which is tied to 3D Secure. That's a big theme because the regulatory requirements are effective January 1, of 2021. And so airlines, agencies, GDSs all continue to push through to make that deadline. Data quality and interchange qualification, we didn't talk anything about this. This generally impacts agencies more. It's still important, or I'm sorry, it impacts airlines more. It's still important to them. There are initiatives, as Kevin talked to keep authorization decline rates low. Each of the card brands focused a little bit on that. Card on file and merchant initiated transaction requirements are becoming more and more important. So for those agencies that store credentials for customers online, 3D Secure and with other sort of fraud detection and prevention tools has made that a little bit more challenging, because now you're asking the customer who's got their credentials stored with you to take an additional step in the payment process, which doesn't work intuitively. So that's something that has been a focus. Fraud volumes are down. Like I said, the fraudsters don't appear to be traveling too much right now, but that doesn't mean they're not perpetrating other types of fraud. And all of the card brands have biannual releases of changes, and the April release was pushed back to July. That was kind of a theme across the card brands. You want to go to the next slide? Takeaways. We're cautiously optimistic for a rebound. So this took place in June, like I said, the week of the 16th. I was hoping that today I would be able to say to you, yeah, we're seeing a bounce back and volumes are coming back. But as you saw from what Kevin provided, we haven't seen a huge bounce back in transactions, not in the US. And so I think we're very cautiously optimistic, but we try to be optimistic. SCA, PSD2 and 3D Secure initiatives continue. There are opportunities to improve data to reduce interchange expense. That's the card expense that airlines pay for every transaction in some markets, and we continue to work on that. Card on file in the agency distribution channel, being able to support that through the GDS, it requires changes by everyone. It's the agencies, it's the GDS, it's ARC, it's the airlines processors and acquirers as well. There's work to be done in the travel agency distribution channel around multi-merchant 3D Secure. So this is getting into some big detail. If you're an agency that wants to do 3D Secure and you're doing hotel, car, and air while the customer's online and you're paying those 3 suppliers separately, or the cards being sent to those suppliers separately, how do we support 3D Secure? Rather than doing 3 separate 3D Secure authentications, which would be silly. So this is for those agents that are deep into doing 3D Secure. And it'll be interesting to see what alternative forms of payment come to the forefront. We're hearing more about installment payments. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens. Next, just to wrap up real quick, I showed this slide last year, which were sort of the themes from the payments industry right now. With 2019, to the next slide, COVID's kind of taken over, and we have some new areas of focus, like disputes and vouchers and how we handle all those. But I think for the next slide, what we may find is that coming out of this, we have developed some efficiencies around chargeback management or just payment processing, and that innovation is going to help us more in the future to get through these difficult times, and that there's opportunity. And for the last slide, this is contact information for Kevin and I. You can reach out to us. Do we have any questions that we can answer here in the last couple minutes?
Yeah, we're down to 1 minute, so.
Like Judy said, this presentation will be made available after this. I have a question about that. Installments, there's a question. Uplift is a big installment company, very focused specifically on travel. There are 2 others that are out there, but Uplift has been the main one. Yep, this will be available on the website afterwards. I think that's all I've got. Judy, can I hand it over to you for a minute?
Okay, thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, Kevin, very much for taking the time to present all of this great information today, and very informative. And thank you, everyone that hung in there with us on this webinar today and took the time to join us. We really appreciate it. And questions, those will be provided to Jennifer and Kevin's team to review and reach out to ones individually. And also, if there are ones that are generic enough, they will do a Q&A, and that document we will post on the ARC website. And as Jennifer said, this presentation will be recorded. It will be on the Corp site under Webinars on Demand, and we'll send it out in the follow-up email. Thank you, everyone, for attending. We look forward to you joining us for many of our sessions in the upcoming Fraud Month in September, so look out for information on that. And also attend our Travel Connect virtual sessions. Those are awesome as well. Thanks, everyone. See you again. Thanks, Jennifer.
Thanks. Bye now.